Welcome to the Sleepy Philosopher, where we explore the deepest wisdom through the gentlest lens of rest and reflection. Tonight we're embarking on a quiet journey into the mind of perhaps history's greatest warrior philosopher, a man who found profound peace in the midst of endless conflict. I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're nestled in a cozy bedroom in Tokyo at midnight, or maybe you're on a quiet evening walk through the countryside, letting these words drift through your earbuds like autumn leaves. Wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable and ready to discover how a legendary samurai's approach to solitude can transform not just how you sleep, but how you find strength in stillness. Before we begin this gentle exploration, a quick favour: if you enjoy these philosophical wanderings into wisdom and rest, a like and subscribe helps this small channel grow, much like how Musashi's teachings spread quietly from student to student across centuries. And to those already part of our contemplative community, thank you. Your presence means more than you know. Now I should warn you, tonight's journey into Musashi's philosophy might be so fascinating that it keeps you wonderfully awake, pondering the nature of inner strength and solitude. But if that happens, at least you'll drift off with the wisdom of a master swordsman who understood that true power comes not from the blade, but from the mind that wields it. So let's begin, shall we? What did it mean to be alone with one's thoughts in 16th century Japan? And how did one man's embrace of solitude forge not just a legendary warrior, but a timeless guide to finding peace within ourselves? Miyamoto Musashi lived in an age of constant warfare, where tomorrow was never guaranteed and strength was measured by the speed of your sword and the steadiness of your spirit. Born around 1584, he entered a world where samurai culture demanded perfection, honour, and an unflinching acceptance of mortality. Yet from this harsh crucible emerged something unexpected, a philosophy of solitude so profound that it continues to offer guidance to restless minds centuries later. Picture, if you will, a young man barely past boyhood, standing alone on a dusty road with nothing but his sword and an unshakable belief in his own path. Musashi began his warrior's journey at the tender age of 13, when he fought and won his first duel against a seasoned adult swordsman. But this wasn't just the story of a prodigy with a blade. This was the beginning of a lifelong relationship with solitude, one that would shape not only his legendary fighting technique, but his understanding of what it truly means to be at peace with oneself. Most of us, when we think of samurai, imagine fierce battles, clashing steel, and dramatic moments of honour and death. But Musashi understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. The most important battles weren't fought on dusty plains or in castle courtyards. They were fought in the quiet spaces of the mind, in those long hours between conflicts when a warrior had nothing but his thoughts for company. This is where our journey into Musashi's guide to inner strength begins, not with sword techniques or battlefield strategies, but with the profound understanding that solitude isn't something to be feared or avoided. It's something to be cultivated, embraced, and ultimately mastered. For Musashi, learning to be alone with oneself wasn't just preparation for combat, it was preparation for life itself. Throughout his remarkable career, which spanned over 60 individual duels without a single defeat, Musashi spent countless hours in what he called the void, that space between thoughts where clarity emerges and true understanding begins. He wandered Japan for decades, often sleeping under stars, meditating in caves, and finding wisdom in the simplest moments of solitary reflection. This wasn't the romantic notion of the lone wolf warrior that popular culture often portrays. This was something far more practical and profound. Musashi discovered that in solitude, away from the noise and expectations of others, the mind naturally settles into deeper patterns of thought. Without the constant need to respond, react, or perform for an audience, consciousness expands into territories that remain hidden during our social hours. He learned to use these quiet moments not as escape from the world, but as preparation for engaging with it more fully. Consider his approach to what we might call productive rest. While most samurai of his era focused intensively on physical training, drilling sword techniques until their muscles ached and their hands bled, Musashi understood that the mind required a different kind of conditioning. He would spend hours in meditation, not the formal, structured meditation of temples, but a kind of alert relaxation where he remained completely present while allowing his thoughts to settle like sediment in still water. This practice, which he refined over decades of solitary wandering, became the foundation of what he would later describe as knowing the way of the warrior through 10,000 things. By learning to be comfortable in his own company, by developing what we might call a friendship with his own mind, Musashi gained access to insights that remained hidden to those who always sought external stimulation or validation. But here's where Musashi's approach becomes particularly relevant to our modern struggle with rest and inner peace. He didn't view solitude as withdrawal from life, but as a way of engaging more deeply with existence itself. When he sat quietly by a stream or rested in a mountain cave, he wasn't escaping reality, he was diving deeper into it. He was learning to perceive the subtle currents of his own consciousness, the way thoughts arise and pass away, the relationship between mental tension and physical relaxation. This understanding led him to develop what he called the strategy of no strategy, a way of approaching challenges without predetermined plans or rigid expectations. Instead of forcing solutions or trying to control outcomes, he learned to remain present and responsive, allowing appropriate action to emerge naturally from a place of inner stillness. This wasn't passive resignation, it was active receptivity, a state of relaxed alertness that modern sleep researchers would recognize as optimal for both rest and problem solving. Musashi's journals, particularly his famous work, The Book of Five Rings, reveal a man who had learned to transform the potentially lonely experience of solitude into something nourishing and strengthening. He wrote about long nights spent under open skies, not as hardship to be endured, but as opportunities to deepen his understanding of his own nature. He described the way moonlight on water could teach lessons about flexibility and adaptation, how the sound of wind in trees could demonstrate the principle of yielding without breaking. What's remarkable about his approach is how he integrated these contemplative practices with the demands of his warrior's life. He never saw meditation and combat as separate activities, but as different expressions of the same fundamental skill, the ability to remain centered and responsive regardless of external circumstances. Whether facing a deadly opponent or sitting quietly by a campfire, the essential practice remained the same, maintaining awareness while releasing attachment to specific outcomes. This integration of action and contemplation, of engagement and solitude, offers us a model for finding inner strength that doesn't require withdrawal from our daily responsibilities. Musashi understood that true solitude isn't about being physically alone, it's about maintaining a core of inner stillness that remains undisturbed regardless of external conditions. He could access this state in the midst of a sword fight just as easily as during hours of silent meditation. His approach to what we might call restorative solitude was remarkably sophisticated. He recognized that different types of mental fatigue required different approaches to renewal. After intense periods of study or training, he would seek out natural settings where his mind could decompress through gentle engagement with simple, repetitive phenomena. The play of light on water, the patterns of clouds across the sky, the rhythmic sounds of rain or ocean waves. But when he needed to work through complex problems or prepare for challenging encounters, he would enter a more focused form of solitude, what he described as sitting with the question. Rather than trying to think his way to solutions, he would hold the essential elements of a challenge gently in awareness, allowing understanding to emerge organically. This practice, which combined elements of what we now recognize as both meditation and creative incubation, became one of his most powerful tools for navigating uncertainty. Musashi also understood something that modern sleep science has only recently begun to appreciate, that the quality of our rest depends heavily on the quality of our relationship with our own minds. He observed that warriors who feared their own thoughts, who needed constant distraction or stimulation, inevitably struggled with both sleep and decision-making under pressure. By contrast, those who had learned to find companionship in solitude, who could rest comfortably in their own mental space, demonstrated greater resilience and clearer judgment in all areas of life. This led him to develop what he called the practice of friendly darkness, a way of approaching sleep not as unconsciousness to be feared, but as a trusted advisor to be welcomed. Most people, he observed, carry the tensions and conflicts of their waking hours into their rest, turning what should be restoration into a continuation of struggle. Their minds race with unfinished conversations, replay mistakes, or worry about future challenges, making sleep an extension of their daily battles rather than a refuge from them. Musashi approached this differently. He understood that the transition from wakefulness to sleep was itself a form of meditation, an opportunity to practice the art of letting go. He would prepare for rest the way other warriors prepared for battle, with intention, respect, and careful attention to the essential elements. But where others armored themselves against external threats, Musashi learned to disarm the internal conflicts that prevented true rest. His evening practice was beautifully simple, yet profound. As darkness approached, he would find a comfortable position and begin what he called the inventory of the day. But this wasn't the anxious reviewing that keeps most of us awake, cataloguing mistakes or rehearsing tomorrow's challenges. Instead, it was a gentle acknowledgement of the day's experiences, allowing each memory to arise, be seen clearly, and then release naturally, like leaves falling from a tree in autumn. He would begin with the physical sensations in his body, noticing areas of tension or fatigue without trying to change them, simply acknowledging what was present. Then he would observe the emotional residues of the day, moments of anger, joy, frustration, or satisfaction, greeting each feeling like an old friend, neither clinging to the pleasant ones nor pushing away the difficult ones. Finally, he would notice the quality of his thoughts, the particular patterns and preoccupations that had coloured his mental landscape. This practice served multiple purposes. It helped him process the day's experiences without getting caught in endless mental loops. It allowed him to identify patterns in his thinking and behaviour that might need adjustment. And most importantly, it cultivated what he described as the art of completion, the ability to fully experience and then release each moment, creating space for genuine rest and renewal. But Musashi's approach to solitude went beyond personal restoration. He understood that the warrior who could not find peace in his own company would inevitably seek it through conquest or achievement, always needing external validation or stimulation to feel complete. Such a person, he observed, becomes enslaved to circumstances, dependent on favourable conditions for their sense of well-being. True strength, he believed, could only emerge from someone who had learned to be content in any situation, whether surrounded by allies or facing enemies alone. This insight led him to develop what might be called a portable philosophy of solitude, a way of accessing inner stillness that didn't depend on ideal external conditions. He learned to find the quiet centre within himself, whether he was sleeping under stars or in a crowded inn, whether preparing for a duel at dawn or simply walking along a country road. The key wasn't controlling his environment, but cultivating a quality of attention that could remain undisturbed regardless of circumstances. One of his most practical discoveries was what he termed the rhythm of natural rest. By observing his own energy patterns over many years of solitary travel, he noticed that his body and mind had their own preferred cycles of activity and restoration. Rather than forcing himself to conform to arbitrary schedules, he learned to work with these natural rhythms, resting when his body genuinely needed rest and remaining active when energy at last was available. This was nighness or self-indulgence, but a sophisticated understanding of human physiology that anticipated many modern insights about circadian rhythms and sleep cycles. Musashi recognized that fighting against his natural patterns created internal conflict that undermined both his rest and his performance. By aligning his schedule with his body's innate wisdom, he discovered reserves of energy and clarity that remained hidden to those who tried to impose rigid external structures on their lives. He also developed what he called the practice of micro-solitudes, brief moments of inner retreat that could be accessed even during busy periods. These weren't formal meditation sessions, but simple pauses where he would return attention to his breath, notice the quality of light around him, or simply rest in present moment awareness for a few heartbeats. These tiny islands of stillness, scattered throughout his days, served as anchors that prevented him from being swept away by the inevitable turbulence of active life. The cumulative effect of these practices was profound. Musashi found that by befriending solitude, by learning to find nourishment rather than loneliness in his own company, he became more present and engaged when interacting with others. His relationships deepened because he wasn't seeking them to fill an inner void or escape from himself. His decision-making improved because he could access the quiet wisdom that emerges only in stillness. And his capacity for both action and rest expanded because he was no longer fighting internal battles that drained his energy. Perhaps most remarkably, Musashi discovered that true solitude, properly understood, wasn't actually about being alone at all. It was about recognizing the fundamental interconnectedness that becomes visible only when the noise of constant activity subsides. In his deepest moments of solitary reflection, he experienced what he described as the great unity, a sense of being intimately connected to all of existence rather than separate from it. This paradox, that solitude could lead to connection rather than isolation, became central to his teaching. He understood that most people avoided being alone because they confused solitude with loneliness, not realizing that loneliness was actually the result of being disconnected from themselves. When someone learned to be comfortable in their own presence, to find the companionship that already existed within their own awareness, they discovered that they were never truly alone. This insight transformed his approach to sleep from a necessary interruption of activity into a sacred practice of a reunion with the deeper currents of existence. Each night became an opportunity to return to the source of his strength, not through escape from the world, but through deeper engagement with the mystery of consciousness itself. Sleep became less about unconsciousness and more about accessing different layers of awareness, including the profound rest that comes from releasing the need to maintain a separate self. The practical implications of Musashi's approach extend far beyond the concerns of 16th century warriors. In our modern world of constant connectivity and stimulation, his insights about the necessity of cultivating solitude feel almost prophetic. We live in an era where many people have lost the ability to be comfortable with their own thoughts, where silence feels threatening rather than nourishing, where the prospect of a few hours without external input creates anxiety rather than anticipation. Musashi would recognize this condition immediately. He who could not sit understood that the warrior quietly with himself, who always needed noise or activity or company to feel at ease, was fundamentally vulnerable. Such a person's strength depended on external conditions that could never be guaranteed. True resilience, he knew, had to be cultivated in solitude, in those quiet moments when we have nothing but our own consciousness for company. His approach offers a practical alternative to our culture's tendency to treat solitude as deprivation rather than opportunity. Instead of viewing quiet moments as empty spaces to be filled with entertainment or distraction, we can learn to experience them as fertile ground for insight and renewal. Instead of rushing towards sleep as escape from the day's challenges, we can approach rest as a chance to integrate and digest our experiences, allowing them to nourish our understanding rather than burden our minds. The samurai's path to inner strength through solitude wasn't about becoming antisocial or withdrawing from engagement with life. It was about developing the internal resources that make meaningful engagement possible. By learning to find completeness within himself, Musashi became more capable of contributing to the world around him. By mastering the art of being alone, he discovered how to be genuinely present with others. This understanding leads us to one of Musashi's most profound discoveries about the relationship between solitude and what he called the invisible opponent. Most warriors, he observed, spent their entire lives preparing to fight external enemies, learning techniques to counter physical attacks, studying the movements and strategies of human adversaries. But Musashi recognized that the most formidable opponent each person faces is never visible on any battlefield. It lives within the landscape of their own mind. This invisible opponent takes many forms. Sometimes it appears as the voice that whispers doubts during crucial moments, the internal critic that replays past mistakes endlessly, or the anxious narrator that spins elaborate stories about future disasters. Other times it manifests as restlessness itself, that persistent feeling that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, isn't quite enough. It's the part of consciousness that can never quite settle, always seeking the next experience, the next achievement, the next distraction from the present moment. Musashi understood that until a warrior learned to face this invisible opponent with the same courage and skill they brought to physical combat, they would never achieve true mastery. And the only place this inner battle could be fought was in solitude, in those quiet spaces where external distractions fell away and the mind's habitual patterns became visible. He developed what he called the strategy of patient observation, a way of watching his own mental processes with the same careful attention he brought to studying an opponent's sword technique. Instead of immediately reacting to uncomfortable thoughts or feelings, he learned to observe them with curiosity, noting their patterns, their triggers, their tendency to arise and pass away naturally when not fed by additional attention. This practice required a kind of courage to particular that had nothing to do with facing steel blades or charging horses. It was the courage to sit with uncertainty, to remain present with whatever arose in rushing to fix consciousness without immediately change or escape it. Musashi discovered that most of what he had previously considered problems were actually just the natural movements of the mind, no more threatening than clouds passing across the sky. Through years of this inner observation, he began to recognize what he termed the great stillness beneath the movement. No matter how turbulent his thoughts became, no matter how intense his emotions, there was always a deeper layer of awareness that remained undisturbed. This wasn't emptiness or void, but a quality of alert presence that could witness any experience without being overwhelmed by it. Learning to rest in this deeper stillness became the foundation of his approach to both sleep and wakefulness. He realized that true rest didn't depend on the absence of mental activity, but on finding the place within himself that was already at peace, regardless of what thoughts or sensations might be arising. This was revolutionary insight for someone living in a culture that often equated strength with constant vigilance and activity. Musashi's evening practice evolved to include what he called the ceremony of settling. As daylight faded, he would create a simple ritual that helped transition his consciousness from the active engagement of day toward the receptive awareness of night. This wasn't about forcing relaxation, but about creating conditions that invited his natural capacity for rest to emerge. He would begin by finding what he called the proper relationship with gravity, allowing his body to settle into whatever position felt most natural, whether sitting against a tree, lying on soft grass, or resting on the wooden floor of a temple. The key wasn't comfort in the conventional sense, but alignment, finding a posture that allowed his body to release unnecessary tension while maintaining dignity and alertness. Next came what he described as the practice of grateful acknowledgement. He would mentally review the day, not as a judge evaluating performance, but as a witness appreciating the full spectrum of experience. Each moment of beauty he had noticed, each challenge he had faced, each person he had encountered, each insight that had emerged, all received the same quality of gentle recognition. This wasn't about positive thinking or forcing gratitude, but about developing the capacity to find meaning and nourishment in whatever life had offered. The practice continued with what Musashi termed the art of conscious transition. Instead of simply waiting for sleep to overtake him, he learned to participate actively in the process of letting go. He would notice the various layers of his awareness, the active thinking mind that planned and analyzed, the emotional body that held the day's joys and concerns, the physical form that carried the accumulated tensions and satisfactions of movement and rest. Rather than trying to shut down these different aspects of himself, he learned to invite them into a state of harmonious cooperation. He would speak to his thinking mind as he might address a trusted advisor, acknowledging its contributions while gently suggesting that its services were no longer needed until morning. He would thank his emotional nature for its sensitivity and responsiveness, while encouraging it to release the day's accumulated impressions. He would appreciate his physical form for its strength and service, while inviting it to soften into the support of the earth. This practice of conscious transition revealed something remarkable about the nature of sleep itself. Musashi discovered that the boundary between waking and sleeping wasn't as sharp as most people assumed. There were subtle gradations of consciousness, different qualities of awareness that could be explored and appreciated. By learning to navigate these transitions deliberately, he found that both his sleep and his waking became more vivid and refreshing. He began to understand sleep not as unconsciousness, but as a different kind of consciousness, one that operated by different rules and offered different gifts. In sleep, the logical mind that insisted on linear thinking and rational analysis could finally rest, making space for other forms of intelligence to emerge. Dreams became not meaningless neural noise, but communications from deeper layers of wisdom that rarely found expression during the demanding focus of daily activity. Musashi developed the ability to maintain a thread of awareness even during deep sleep, not in the sense of preventing rest, but in the sense of remaining gently conscious of the process of resting itself. He described this as sleeping like a cat, maintaining a quality of relaxed alertness that allowed for complete restoration while preserving the capacity to respond instantly if circumstances required it. This wasn't about becoming a light sleeper or remaining perpetually vigilant. It was about discovering that consciousness itself never actually sleeps, only changes its mode of operation. The awareness that could observe thoughts during meditation was the same awareness that could rest peacefully during sleep while remaining subtly present throughout the night. Through this practice, Musashi found that his dreams became more coherent and instructive. Instead of the random fragments and anxious repetitions that characterize much dream experience, his sleeping mind began to offer clear insights about challenges he was facing, creative solutions to problems he was working through, and sometimes profound spiritual experiences that deepened his understanding of existence itself. He learned to approach his dreams the way he approached his waking experiences, with respectful attention and willingness to learn. Upon awakening, he would spend a few moments in what he called the bridge of remembering, gently reviewing whatever dream experiences he could recall, not trying to analyze or interpret them, but simply receiving them as gifts from the deeper dimensions of his own consciousness. This integration of sleeping and waking awareness had practical benefits that extended far beyond improved rest. Musashi found that his intuitive perception became sharper, his ability to read situations and people more accurate, his capacity for creative problem-solving enhanced. By learning to access the wisdom that emerged during sleep, he gained additional resources for navigating the challenges of his waking life. The samurai's approach to solitude also encompassed what he called the practice of seasonal adaptation. Living in close contact with natural cycles, he observed that his own rhythms of activity and rest changed throughout the year, and that fighting against these natural fluctuations created unnecessary internal conflict. During winter's long nights, he would allow himself more sleep and contemplative time. During summer's extended daylight, he found he needed less rest and could sustain longer periods of activity. This wasn't about being lazy during dark months or manic during bright ones, but about developing sensitivity to the subtle ways that natural cycles influenced his energy and awareness. By aligning his practices with these larger rhythms, he discovered reserves of vitality that remained hidden when he tried to maintain the same schedule, regardless of seasonal changes. Musashi also recognized that different life phases called for different approaches to solitude and rest. The intense training period of his youth required one kind of practice, focused on building discipline and endurance. The middle years of his career, when he was actively engaged in dueling and travel, demanded another approach that balanced action with restoration. And his later years, when he turned more toward teaching and writing, invited yet another way of cultivating inner strength through contemplative practice. This adaptability became one of the hallmarks of his philosophy. Rather than adhering rigidly to fixed techniques, he remained responsive to the changing needs of his body, mind, and circumstances. The principles remained constant, but their application evolved continuously, like a river that maintains its essential character while adapting its course to the landscape it encounters. The practical wisdom that emerged from Musashi's decades of solitary practice offers remarkable guidance for anyone struggling with the challenge of finding rest and renewal in a demanding world. His insights about the relationship between inner stillness and outer effectiveness, between solitude and connection, between conscious rest and vibrant wakefulness, feel especially relevant in our era of constant stimulation and digital distraction. Perhaps most importantly, Musashi understood that learning to be alone with oneself wasn't a luxury or indulgence, but an essential life skill. Just as a warrior needed to master the use of sword and strategy, anyone seeking to live with wisdom and effectiveness needed to master the art of solitude. This wasn't about becoming a hermit or withdrawing from social engagement, but about developing the internal resources that make meaningful participation in life possible. His approach offers an alternative to the modern tendency to treat rest as merely the absence of activity, or solitude as simply being physically alone. Through his example, we can begin to understand rest as an active practice of conscious renewal, and solitude as an opportunity for deepening our relationship with the mystery of our own existence. The legendary swordsman discovered that true strength wasn't about hardening oneself against the world, but about developing the flexibility and resilience that come from being firmly rooted in inner stillness. Like a tree that can bend with strong winds because its roots reach deep into nourishing soil, the person who has learned to find strength in solitude can engage fully with life's challenges without being uprooted by them. This rootedness in inner stillness became the foundation of what Musashi called effortless effort, a way of acting that emerged naturally from rest rather than forcing its way forward through willpower alone. When action arose from a place of genuine rest and clarity, it carried a different quality, more precise, more effective, and paradoxically more powerful, despite requiring less strain and struggle. Through his mastery of solitude, Musashi discovered that the greatest victory wasn't defeating external opponents, but learning to live in harmony with the full spectrum of his own consciousness. This inner victory made all other achievements possible, not through conquest, but through the natural expression of a mind and body that had learned to work together in seamless cooperation. As we follow Musashi deeper into his understanding of solitude's transformative power, we encounter one of his most counterintuitive discoveries, what he called the paradox of the empty cup. Most people, he observed, approach rest and renewal the way a traveller approaches a well, seeking to fill themselves with something they believe they lack. They pursue sleep to gain energy, seek quiet to escape noise, embrace solitude to flee from social demands. But Musashi learned that true restoration works in the opposite direction. The way to genuine strength, he discovered, wasn't through accumulation, but through subtraction. Like a sculptor who reveals the statue by removing everything that isn't essential, the path to inner power involved learning what to release rather than what to acquire. This insight emerged during his years of wandering, when he carried nothing but his swords and relied entirely on his ability to find sustenance in whatever circumstances arose. During one particularly harsh winter, sheltering in a mountain cave with only thin clothing and meagre provisions, Musashi experienced what he later described as the Great Emptying. As hunger gnawed at his belly and cold seeped into his bones, he initially fought against the discomfort, tensing his muscles and filling his mind with complaints and wishes for better conditions. But as the night deepened and his resistance proved futile, something unexpected occurred. Instead of continuing to struggle against his situation, he began to observe it with the same dispassionate attention he brought to studying an opponent's technique. He noticed how his body contracted around pain, how his mind spun stories about suffering, how his emotions cycled between self-pity and anger. And in that space of pure observation, without trying to change anything, a profound shift occurred. The discomfort didn't disappear, but his relationship to it transformed completely. Where he had previously experienced resistance and struggle, he now found a quality of spacious awareness that could hold any sensation without being overwhelmed by it. The cold was still cold, hunger was still hunger, but these experiences no longer defined the totality of his being. They became simply phenomena arising within a much larger field of consciousness. This revelation led to what Musashi termed the discipline of welcome difficulty. Rather than seeking comfort and avoiding challenge, he began to view uncomfortable experiences as opportunities to deepen his understanding of his own capacity, not in a masochistic way, but with the recognition that every situation, pleasant or unpleasant, offered teachings about the nature of awareness itself. He learned to distinguish between pain and suffering, understanding that while pain might be unavoidable, suffering was always optional. Pain was simply information, signals from the body or circumstances that required attention. Suffering was the stories the mind told about that pain, the resistance and elaboration that transformed temporary discomfort into prolonged anguish. This distinction became crucial to his approach to rest and restoration. Most people, he noticed, carried their daytime struggles into their evening rest. Not just the physical tensions, but the emotional and mental elaborations around those tensions. They would replay conversations, imagining better responses. They would rehearse future challenges, creating anxiety about events that might never occur. They would judge their own performance, comparing themselves to others or to impossible standards. All of this mental activity, Musashi recognized, was a form of suffering that had little connection to actual present moment experience. The body might be tired from the day's activities, but the mind's stories about that tiredness created additional layers of fatigue that prevented genuine rest. The heart might carry some residual emotion from interpersonal encounters, but the endless analysis and interpretation of those emotions generated new tensions that disturbed sleep. His solution was elegantly simple, yet profoundly challenging to implement. Each evening, as part of his settling practice, he would perform what he called the ceremony of return. This wasn't a formal ritual, but a gentle process of returning his attention again and again to immediate sensory experience rather than mental commentary about that experience. He would begin by noticing the actual physical sensations in his body without the stories his mind wanted to tell about them. A tight shoulder wasn't evidence of stress that needed to be analysed and solved. It was simply a particular pattern of sensation that could be observed with curiosity. A racing heart wasn't a problem to be fixed, but a rhythm that could be witnessed and appreciated for its own sake. Similarly, he learned to observe emotions as temporary weather patterns in the sky of consciousness, rather than solid realities that defined his identity. Anger could arise and be acknowledged without becoming an angry person. Sadness could pass through without transforming into someone who is sad. Joy could be experienced fully, without grasping after it or trying to make it permanent. This practice of returning to immediate experience, away from mental elaboration, created what Musashi described as the natural gap. In this space between raw experience and the mind's interpretation of that experience, a profound rest became available. Not the heavy unconsciousness that comes from exhaustion, but a light, aware relaxation that restored both body and spirit. The samurai discovered that this natural gap existed not only during formal rest periods, but could be accessed throughout the day. During sword practice, there were moments between techniques when awareness could rest in pure presence. During travel, there were steps when attention could settle into the simple rhythm of walking. During conversation, there were pauses when listening could deepen beyond the urge to formulate responses. These micro-rests, scattered throughout active engagement with life, prevented the accumulation of tension that made evening restoration so necessary. By learning to touch this natural gap repeatedly during waking hours, Musashi found that his need for recovery decreased while his capacity for sustained activity increased. This led him to understand what he called the economy of energy. Most people, he observed, leaked vitality through unconscious tension, mental churning, and emotional reactivity. They worked much harder than necessary to accomplish simple tasks because they hadn't learned to distinguish between effort and strain. Effort was the appropriate application of energy to meet a situation's demands. Strain was the extra layer of struggle that came from fighting against what was already happening. Learning to work with effort while releasing strain became one of Musashi's most practical discoveries. Whether swinging a sword or preparing a meal, walking along a road or sitting in meditation, he practiced finding the minimum amount of energy required to meet each moment fully. This wasn't about becoming lazy or half-hearted, but about developing such sensitivity to the present situation that response could emerge with precision rather than excess. This principle extended naturally into his approach to sleep preparation. Instead of trying to force relaxation through effort, he learned to create conditions that invited rest to arise naturally. Rather than commanding his body to release tension, he would simply direct gentle attention to areas of tightness, allowing them to soften in their own time. Instead of demanding that his mind become quiet, he would offer it interesting but non-stimulating focal points, like the sensation of breathing or the sounds of night settling around him. Musashi's understanding of what he termed collaborative rest emerged from recognizing that genuine restoration required cooperation between all levels of his being rather than the dominance of will over body and emotion. His evening practice evolved into a kind of internal diplomacy, where different aspects of himself were invited to participate in the transition towards sleep rather than being forced into submission. He would address his physical form with the respect due to a loyal companion, acknowledging the day's service while requesting its willingness to release the day's accumulated tensions. He would speak to his emotional nature as he might converse with a sensitive friend, appreciating its responsiveness while encouraging it to let go of the day's impressions. He would treat his thinking mind like a dedicated advisor whose counsel had been valuable, but whose services could now rest until morning. This collaborative approach dissolved the internal conflicts that kept many people awake despite physical exhaustion. Instead of different parts of himself working at cross purposes, all aspects of his being could align in support of rest and renewal. The result was sleep that felt less like temporary unconsciousness and more like a harmonious settling into deeper layers of awareness. Through years of refining this practice, Musashi developed what might be called a portable sanctuary of inner stillness. Regardless of external circumstances, whether sleeping on silk cushions or rocky ground, in perfect silence, or amid the sounds of wind and rain, he could access the same quality of restorative rest. This wasn't because he had learned to ignore discomfort, but because he had discovered the place within himself that remained peaceful regardless of changing conditions. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond improved sleep. Musashi realized that the same qualities that supported genuine rest also enhanced every other aspect of living. The ability to remain present without mental elaboration improved his perception during combat. The skill of releasing unnecessary tension made his movements more fluid and efficient. The practice of collaborative internal dialogue enhanced his capacity for harmonious relationships with others. Most significantly, he found that mastering the art of conscious rest transformed his relationship with uncertainty and change. When someone has learned to find peace within their own consciousness, external fluctuations become less threatening. Challenges remain challenging, but they no longer disturb the deeper equilibrium that comes from being firmly rooted in inner stillness. This rootedness allowed Musashi to approach life with what he called relaxed intensity, a way of engaging fully with whatever arose while maintaining the inner space that prevented overwhelm. Like a master musician who can play the most complex passages while remaining physically relaxed, he learned to navigate life's demands with complete commitment while preserving the inner stillness that was the source of his strength. The practical applications of Musashi's discoveries about solitude and rest speak directly to our modern challenges with sleep, stress, and the constant stimulation of contemporary life. His insights about the difference between effort and strain offer guidance for anyone struggling with the exhaustion that comes from working harder rather than smarter. His understanding of collaborative rest provides tools for those whose minds race when their bodies are ready for sleep. Perhaps most valuable is his recognition that true rest comes not from escaping from life, but from learning to be fully present with whatever life offers. In a culture that often treats sleep as merely recovery from the day's battles, Musashi's approach suggests that rest can be a positive practice of conscious renewal rather than simply the absence of activity. His discovery of the natural gap between experience and interpretation offers a practical way to reduce the mental churning that prevents restful sleep. By learning to observe thoughts and feelings without immediately analyzing or solving them, we can create the internal spaciousness that allows genuine rest to emerge naturally. The samurai's approach to what he called seasonal consciousness also provides insight into working with our natural rhythms rather than against them. Just as he learned to adapt his practices to the changing cycles of nature, we can develop sensitivity to our own energy patterns, honoring the times when our bodies and minds naturally seek more rest, while fully engaging when vitality is abundant. Musashi understood that the cultivation of inner strength through solitude wasn't a solitary endeavor in the sense of being separate from the world. Rather, it was a way of developing the internal resources that make meaningful contribution to others possible. By learning to find completeness within himself, he became more capable of serving the larger purposes that called to him. This understanding challenges our culture's tendency to view self-care and service to others as competing priorities. Musashi's example suggests that taking time for genuine rest and solitary reflection isn't selfish withdrawal, but essential preparation for effective engagement with the world's needs. The person who has learned to find strength in stillness brings that strength to every interaction and endeavor. The legendary warrior's final insight about solitude might be his most profound. Through decades of practice, he discovered that true aloneness was actually a form of ultimate connection. In the deepest experiences of solitary awareness, the sense of being a separate self dissolved into recognition of the fundamental unity that connects all existence. This wasn't a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that transformed how he understood both rest and action. In these moments of profound solitude, Musashi found that he wasn't alone at all, but intimately connected to the same consciousness that moved the stars, grew the trees, and flowed in the rivers. Sleep became not withdrawal from the world, but conscious participation in the larger rhythms that sustain all life. Rest became not escape from responsibility, but alignment with the deeper intelligence that guides all natural processes. This recognition transformed his final years from a period of retirement into a time of deepened engagement with existence itself. Having mastered the art of finding strength in solitude, he discovered that solitude and connection were not opposites, but different aspects of the same fundamental reality. The inner stillness he had cultivated through years of practice became a bridge to the stillness that underlies all movement, the silence that gives birth to all sound, the emptiness that is the source of all form. Through Musashi's eyes, we begin to see that learning to rest deeply isn't just about getting better sleep or managing stress more effectively. It's about discovering our fundamental nature as expressions of the same consciousness that rests at the heart of existence itself. When we learn to find strength in solitude, we're not withdrawing from life, but learning to participate in it more fully, bringing the gifts of inner stillness to a world that desperately needs the wisdom that emerges only in silence. The samurai's path shows us that true power doesn't come from accumulating external achievements or conquering external opponents. It emerges from the courage to sit quietly with ourselves, to befriend our own consciousness, and to discover the inexhaustible source of strength that has the depths of our own being. Been waiting patiently within us all along, akin to the profound rest that is always available in learning to sleep with inner strength, as we follow Musashi deeper into the mysteries of what he called the warrior's rest, we encounter perhaps his most revolutionary understanding about the nature of strength itself. Most samurai of his era believed that power came from hardening oneself, building impenetrable defenses against life's inevitable challenges. They trained their bodies to endure pain without flinching, disciplined their minds to suppress doubt and fear, and cultivated an iron will that could push through any obstacle. But Musashi discovered something entirely different through his years of solitary contemplation. True strength, he realized, wasn't about becoming rigid or impermeable. It was about developing what he termed the flexibility of water, a quality that could adapt to any container while maintaining its essential nature. Water doesn't fight against the rocks in a riverbed. It flows around them, gradually wearing away even the hardest stone through patient persistence. Similarly, the warrior who had learned to find strength in solitude could meet any challenge without breaking, not because they were harder than their circumstances, but because they had learned to move with life rather than against it. This insight emerged during what Musashi described as the season of great questioning. After years of victory in formal duels, he found himself increasingly troubled by a paradox. Each triumph brought him fame and recognition, yet he felt no closer to understanding what he was truly seeking. The external validation that others envied left him feeling strangely empty, as if he were winning battles while losing sight of the war that mattered most. During this period of uncertainty, Musashi made a decision that shocked his contemporaries. At the height of his reputation, when challenges and opportunities arrived daily, he withdrew from public life entirely. For nearly 3 years he lived as a hermit in the mountains, surviving on wild plants and stream water, sleeping in caves and speaking to no one for months at a time. To outside observers, it appeared that the great swordsman had lost his mind or given up on life entirely. But Musashi was conducting the most important experiment of his career. He was testing whether the strength he had cultivated through years of training and combat could survive in complete solitude, stripped of all external supports and validations. Could he maintain his warrior spirit without opponents to defeat? Could he preserve his sense of purpose without a society to impress? Could he find meaning in existence without any audience to witness his achievements? The first months of this self-imposed exile were brutal. Without the familiar rhythms of training, travel, and social interaction, Musashi confronted aspects of himself that had remained hidden during his active years. Waves of doubt crashed over him like storm surges, questioning every choice he had made, every victory he had claimed, every principle he had lived by. There were nights when loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest, days when the silence seemed to mock his previous confidence. But gradually, as the seasons turned and his resistance to solitude began to soften, something unexpected started to emerge. Beneath the surface turbulence of his questioning mind, Musashi began to sense a deeper current of awareness that remained undisturbed by his emotional storms. This wasn't the absence of feeling, but a quality of spacious presence that could hold any experience without being diminished by it. He described this discovery in his journals as meeting the undefeated self. All his life, he had identified with the persona of Musashi, the swordsman, the warrior who had never lost a duel, the master who commanded respect and admiration. But now, stripped of all external roles and achievements, he encountered something far more fundamental. There was an aspect of his being that had never been threatened by any opponent, never needed to prove itself through victory, never required external validation to know its own worth. This undefeated self wasn't proud or arrogant. It had no need to compare itself to others or to accumulate achievements. It simply was, with the same effortless presence that characterized mountains or rivers or stars. It had been there throughout all his years of striving and seeking, patiently waiting for him to stop looking elsewhere for what he already possessed in abundance. The recognition of this deeper identity transformed Musashi's understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. He realized that all his previous battles, whether with steel or with circumstances, had been external reflections of an internal process. He had been fighting to protect and strengthen something that was already invincible, seeking to prove something that needed no proof, trying to achieve a victory that had been his birthright all along. This revelation led to what he called the practice of effortless discipline. Previously, his training had been driven by will and determination, pushing himself to practice longer, fight harder, endure more than his competitors. Now he discovered a different kind of discipline that arose naturally from alignment with his deeper nature, rather than from forcing himself to conform to external standards. When he resumed his sword practice after months of stillness, the movements felt entirely different. Instead of imposing technique through muscular effort, he found that his body seemed to know instinctively how to move with maximum efficiency and minimum strain. His breathing synchronized naturally with his actions. His mind remained calm and clear, even during the most complex sequences. It was as if his years of forced training had finally yielded to a more organic way of being that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. This effortless quality extended beyond physical practice into every aspect of his daily routine. Preparing meals became a form of meditation. Walking through the forest turned into a dance with the natural world. Even the simple act of gathering firewood carried the same quality of alert presence that he brought to sword work. Life itself had become his practice, and practice had become indistinguishable from life. Musashi began to understand what the ancient masters meant when they spoke of actionless action. This wasn't passivity or laziness, but a way of engaging with life that flowed from inner stillness rather than outer compulsion. Actions arose naturally from present moment awareness rather than from predetermined plans or reactive patterns. Decisions emerged from deep listening rather than analytical thinking. Responses came from wisdom rather than habit. This transformation had profound implications for his approach to rest and renewal. Previously, sleep had been something he scheduled around his training, a necessary interruption of more important activities. Now he began to see rest as an integral part of the warrior's path, not separate from practice, but essential to it. Sleep became an opportunity to deepen his connection with the effortless awareness he had discovered in solitude. His evening routine evolved into what he called the ceremony of conscious descent. As darkness approached, instead of simply lying down and hoping for unconsciousness, he would create a deliberate transition from the focused awareness of day toward the open awareness of night. This wasn't about controlling the process of falling asleep, but about participating consciously in the natural rhythm of consciousness as it moved through different states. He would begin by acknowledging the day's activities with the same respectful attention he brought to cleaning his sword after practice. Each experience, whether pleasant or challenging, received equal recognition as part of his ongoing education in the art of living. This wasn't analysis or judgment, but simple acknowledgement, like bowing to a practice partner after a training session. Next came what he termed the practice of grateful release. Instead of carrying the day's tensions and preoccupations into his rest, Musashi would consciously offer them back to the larger intelligence that guided all natural processes. This wasn't about suppressing or denying his concerns, but about recognizing that his individual efforts were part of a much greater movement that continued even when his personal will was at rest. He would visualize his worries and plans as leaves falling from a tree in autumn, each one beautiful and necessary in its season, but naturally ready to return to the earth that had nourished it. This image helped him release attachment to outcomes while maintaining appreciation for the process itself. His problems didn't disappear, but they no longer felt like burdens he had to carry alone through the night. The ceremony concluded with what Musashi called the invitation to mystery. Instead of approaching sleep as unconsciousness, he learned to welcome it as an opportunity to participate in aspects of existence that remained hidden during waking hours. Sleep became a form of surrender, not to defeat or exhaustion, but to the deeper intelligence that orchestrated dreams, healing, and the countless processes that renewed his body and spirit while his conscious mind rested. This approach to sleep preparation had remarkable effects on both the quality of his rest and his waking consciousness. Dreams became more vivid and coherent, often providing insights about challenges he was facing or directions he might explore. His body's natural healing processes seemed to accelerate, leaving him refreshed after fewer hours of sleep. Most importantly, he began to experience what he described as the continuity of awareness, a thread of conscious presence that remained gently active even during deep sleep. This wasn't about maintaining vigilance or preventing deep rest. Rather, it was about discovering that awareness itself never actually sleeps, only changes its mode of operation. The same consciousness that could observe thoughts during meditation could rest peacefully during sleep while remaining subtly present throughout the night. This discovery dissolved the artificial boundary between sleeping and waking states, revealing them as different movements within a single, continuous field of awareness. Musashi found that this continuity of awareness enhanced every aspect of his life. His intuition became sharper, his perception more subtle, his responses more immediate and appropriate. He could sense the intentions of potential opponents before they became conscious of them themselves. He could read the weather patterns days in advance by attending to barely perceptible shifts in atmospheric pressure. He could navigate complex social situations with an almost supernatural understanding of the unspoken currents flowing between people. These abilities weren't supernatural in the sense of being beyond natural law. They were the natural result of learning to operate from a more integrated level of consciousness, where the artificial divisions between thinking and feeling, between self and environment, between sleeping and waking, had dissolved into a more fluid and responsive way of being. The integration of conscious rest with daily activity led Musashi to develop what he called the rhythm of natural excellence. Instead of pushing himself to maintain constant peak performance, he learned to work with the natural cycles of expansion and contraction that characterized all living systems. There were times for intense focus and effort, balanced by periods of gentle receptivity and rest. There were seasons for bold action, followed by intervals of patient observation and contemplation. By aligning his activities with these natural rhythms rather than fighting against them, Musashi discovered reserves of energy and creativity that had remained inaccessible when he tried to force consistent output regardless of internal conditions. His work became more efficient because it flowed from genuine inspiration rather than willful determination. His rest became more restorative because it arose from natural completion rather than exhausted collapse. This rhythmic approach to living required developing what he termed exquisite sensitivity to the subtle signals that indicated when to advance and when to retreat, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. This sensitivity could only be cultivated in solitude during those quiet moments when the noise of external demands subsided enough for inner guidance to become audible. Musashi spent hours each day in what he called the practice of deep listening, sitting quietly and attending to the barely perceptible movements of energy within his body, the subtle shifts in his emotional atmosphere, the gentle nudges of intuition that arose from sources deeper than rational analysis. This wasn't passive meditation, but active receptivity, a way of gathering information that complemented but didn't replace logical thinking. Through this practice, he developed an almost uncanny ability to make decisions that proved correct even when they contradicted conventional wisdom or immediate appearances. He could sense when to accept a challenge and when to decline, when to trust someone and when to remain cautious, when to pursue an opportunity and when to let it pass. This guidance didn't come from supernatural sources, but from learning to access the natural intelligence that operated below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. The practical applications of these insights extended far beyond personal effectiveness. Musashi began to understand that the same principles that governed individual consciousness also operated at larger scales. Communities, like individuals, had natural rhythms of activity and rest. Societies went through cycles of expansion and consolidation. Even civilizations followed patterns of growth, maturity, and renewal that paralleled the processes he had discovered within himself. This recognition led him to develop what might be called an ecological approach to human existence, understanding each person as part of larger systems that required balance and cooperation for optimal functioning. The warrior, who had learned to find strength in solitude, could contribute to the health of these larger systems precisely because he was no longer driven by personal neediness or compulsive activity. Instead of trying to force his will upon circumstances, Musashi learned to sense what each situation required and offer that gift naturally. Sometimes what was needed was decisive action. Other times, patient waiting. Sometimes leadership was called for. Other times, humble service. Sometimes speaking truth was essential. Other times, maintaining silence served the greater good. This responsive way of being required tremendous self-knowledge and inner stability. Only someone who had learned to find completeness within themselves could offer their gifts freely, without attachment to recognition or reward. Only someone who had discovered the undefeated self could act with courage without being driven by the need to prove their worth. Only someone who had mastered the art of conscious rest could sustain effective action without burning out or becoming depleted. Musashi's later years demonstrated the practical fruits of his deep engagement with solitude and conscious rest. Rather than declining into the irrelevance that often characterized aging warriors, he entered what he described as the season of effortless mastery. His movements became more economical, yet more powerful. His strategic thinking became simpler, yet more penetrating. His teaching became more subtle, yet more transformative. Students who came expecting to learn sword techniques found themselves receiving lessons in the art of living itself. Through his presence more than his words, Musashi demonstrated what it looked like to embody the principles he had discovered in solitude. He showed them that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering oneself, not about accumulating victories, but about learning to rest in the victory that was already present in each moment. His final teachings emphasized what he called the pathless path, a way of approaching life that couldn't be reduced to fixed techniques or rigid formulas. Like water finding its way down a mountainside, each person had to discover their own route to the fundamental truths that Musashi had encountered in his years of solitary practice. The principles were universal, but their application was infinitely individual. This understanding led him to encourage his students to develop their own relationship with solitude, rather than simply copying his methods. Some found their deepest insights during early morning meditation, others during evening contemplation. Some discovered wisdom in mountain retreats, others in urban temples. Some accessed inner stillness through movement, others through complete physical rest. What mattered wasn't the specific form their practice took, but the quality of attention they brought to it. The essential requirement was willingness to meet themselves honestly in the spaciousness of solitude, without the familiar distractions and defenses that usually prevented deep self-knowledge. This required a particular kind of courage that had nothing to do with facing external dangers and everything to do with confronting the unknown territories within their own consciousness. Musashi understood that this inner courage was both the most difficult and the most necessary quality for anyone seeking to live with genuine strength and wisdom. It was far easier to face a sword-wielding opponent than to sit quietly with one's own fears, doubts, and longings. External enemies could be defeated through superior technique or strategy, but the internal challenges that arose in solitude required a completely different approach. Instead of fighting against uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the practitioner of conscious solitude learned to welcome them as teachers. Instead of trying to maintain a perfect mental state, they developed the capacity to remain present with whatever arose. Instead of seeking to control their inner experience, they discovered the freedom that came from learning to dance with the constantly changing movements of their own consciousness. This dance required what Musashi termed the discipline of gentle persistence. Unlike the forced discipline that relied on willpower and determination, this was a softer, yet more sustainable approach that worked with natural rhythms rather than against them. When resistance arose, instead of pushing through it, the practitioner would pause and listen to what the resistance was trying to communicate. When distraction appeared, instead of fighting it, they would acknowledge it with kindness and gently return attention to their chosen focus. This gentle approach proved far more effective than harsh self-discipline because it enlisted the cooperation of all aspects of the personality rather than creating internal war. The part of the mind that wanted to wander wasn't treated as an enemy to be defeated, but as a curious child to be understood and guided. The emotions that arose during contemplation weren't suppressed but welcomed as valuable information about the current state of the inner landscape. Through this collaborative relationship with his own consciousness, Musashi discovered that what he had previously considered obstacles to peace were actually doorways to deeper understanding. Anxiety, when met with patient attention, revealed important information about areas of life that needed care or adjustment. Sadness, when welcomed rather than avoided, connected him to the tenderness that made compassion possible. Even anger, when observed with curiosity rather than judgment, showed him where his values were being compromised or his boundaries needed strengthening. This transformed his relationship not only with his own inner experience, but with the challenges that arose in daily life. Difficulties that had previously seemed like problems to be solved or enemies to be defeated became opportunities for deeper learning and growth. Each obstacle revealed something about his remaining attachments or areas where his understanding was still incomplete. The samurai's approach to what he called the art of conscious dying emerged from this understanding of Challenger's teacher. Every evening, as he prepared for sleep, he would practice releasing his attachment to the day's identity, the roles he had played, the successes and failures he had accumulated, even his sense of being a separate individual with a unique story and destiny. This wasn't morbid contemplation, but practical preparation for the small death that sleep represents each night. By learning to let go gracefully of his waking identity, Musashi found that he could access deeper layers of rest and renewal that remained unavailable to those who clung to their daytime personas, even in sleep. Each night became an opportunity to die to the limited self and be reborn in the morning with fresh perspective and renewed vitality. This practice of conscious dying also prepared him for the eventual transition that awaited all living beings. Death, he realized, was simply the final and go that he'd most complete expression of the letting practiced every evening. By learning to release attachment to temporary identities and experiences, he was preparing for the ultimate release that would one day be required of him. But rather than making him morbid or detached from life, this awareness of impermanence made each moment more precious and vivid. Knowing that everything was temporary made him more present with whatever was occurring right now. Understanding that his time was limited made him more selective about how he invested his energy and attention. Recognizing that death was simply part of life's natural cycle made him more willing to take risks and embrace uncertainty. The warrior's final insight about solitude and rest might be his most profound contribution to understanding the nature of human existence. Through decades of practice, Musashi discovered that the strength he had been seeking through external achievement had been present within him all along, not as something he needed to develop, but as the very or acquire ground of his being. This recognition didn't diminish his appreciation for skill, accomplishment, or engagement with the world. Rather, it provided an unshakable foundation from which all activities could arise naturally and effortlessly. Like a tree that grows strong because its roots reach deep into nourishing soil, the person who has learned to find strength in solitude can engage fully with life's demands while remaining grounded in inner stillness. The practical implications of Musashi's discoveries extend far beyond the concerns of medieval warriors or contemplative hermits. In our contemporary world of constant connectivity and relentless stimulation, his insights about the necessity of solitude feel almost prophetic. We live in an era where many people have lost the ability to be comfortable with their own thoughts, where silence feels threatening rather than nourishing, where the prospect of time without external input creates anxiety rather than anticipation. Musashi would recognize this condition as a form of spiritual poverty that undermines both individual well-being and collective wisdom. The person who cannot sit quietly with themselves, who always needs noise or activity or company to feel at ease, is fundamentally vulnerable because their sense of well-being depends on external conditions that can never be guaranteed. His approach offers a practical alternative to our culture's tendency to treat solitude as loneliness and rest as merely the absence of activity. Instead of viewing quiet moments as empty spaces to be filled with entertainment or distraction, we can learn to experience them as opportunities for renewal and insight. Instead of approaching sleep as unconscious escape from the day's challenges, we can discover rest as a conscious practice of integration and restoration. The Sam's strength doesn't require constant activity. Urai's path shows us that, true or external validation, it emerges from the courage to meet ourselves honestly in the spaciousness of solitude, to befriend our own consciousness, and to discover the inexhaustible source of vitality that has been waiting patiently within us all along. In learning to sleep with inner strength, we awaken to the profound rest that is always available in the depths of our own being, regardless of external circumstances. This awakening transforms not only our relationship with rest, but our engagement with all aspects of life. When action arises from inner stillness rather than compulsive doing, it carries a different quality that is more effective while requiring less effort. When decisions emerge from deep listening rather than anxious analysis, they align more naturally with our authentic values and purposes. When we learn to find completeness within ourselves, we can offer our gifts to the world freely, without attachment to recognition or reward. Through Musashi's example, we see that the path to genuine strength isn't about hardening ourselves against life's challenges, but about developing the flexibility and resilience that come from being deeply rooted in inner peace. Like water that can adapt to any container while maintaining its essential nature, the person who has mastered the art of conscious solitude can meet any situation with grace and effectiveness. The legendary swordsman's greatest victory wasn't over any external opponent, but over the illusion of separation that keeps most people trapped in cycles of striving and dissatisfaction. By learning to find strength in solitude, he discovered that he was never truly alone, but intimately connected to the same consciousness that moves the stars and grows the trees. In this recognition, the boundary between rest and action, between solitude and connection, between self and world, dissolved into the seamless flow of awakened living. As we prepare to conclude our gentle journey through Musashi's approach to finding inner strength through solitude, we're left with an invitation rather than a destination. His path cannot be walked by anyone else, but his discoveries point toward possibilities that remain available to anyone willing to explore the depths of their own consciousness with courage, patience, and respect. The way begins not with dramatic gestures or exotic practices, but with the simple willingness to spend time alone with ourselves, to listen deeply to what arises in the silence, and to discover what remains when all external supports are temporarily set aside. In these quiet moments, away from the familiar roles and identities that usually define us, we may encounter the same undefeated self that Musashi found in his mountain cave centuries ago, the same source of strength that needs no external validation because it is complete in itself. This discovery doesn't mark the end of our journey, but its true beginning, for only when we have learned to find completeness within ourselves can we offer our authentic gifts to a world that desperately needs the wisdom that emerges from genuine solitude. The path of the warrior, as Musashi understood it, leads not away from life, but deeper into its mystery, not into isolation, but into the kind of connection that becomes possible when we are no longer seeking from others what we have learned to find within ourselves. In the quiet hours before dawn, when most of the world still rests in the embrace of sleep, Musashi would begin what he called the practice of first light. This wasn't merely an early rising routine, but a deliberate engagement with the liminal space between night and day, that precious threshold where consciousness emerges from the depths of rest into the possibilities of a new beginning. He understood that how we transition from sleep to wakefulness sets the tone for everything that follows. Most people, he observed, jolted themselves awake with harsh sounds or urgent thoughts about the day's demands, immediately fracturing the wholeness they had touched during the night. They would leap from bed as if sleep were an enemy to be defeated rather than a teacher to be honoured, carrying the violence of their awakening into every subsequent moment. Musashi discovered a gentler way. He learned to surface from sleep like a pearl diver, rising slowly through layers of ocean, allowing each level of consciousness to emerge naturally without forcing the process. This gradual awakening preserved the gifts that sleep had offered, the insights that had crystallized in dreams, the physical restoration that had occurred during the night's invisible healing. His morning practice began before his eyes opened, in that floating space where awareness returns, but the mind hasn't yet engaged with the world's complexity. He would rest in what he called the luxury of not knowing, allowing himself to exist for a few precious moments without immediately defining who he was, what he needed to accomplish, or what challenges awaited him. In this space of pure being, he could touch again the undefeated self he had discovered in solitude, that core of awareness that remained constant through all of life's changes. Gradually, like light slowly illuminating a landscape, he would allow his senses to awaken one by one. First came the awareness of his body resting against whatever surface had supported him through the night, feeling the weight and warmth of his physical form without immediately judging its comfort or discomfort. Then came the sounds around him, the morning chorus of birds perhaps, or the whisper of wind through trees, each sound received as a gift rather than an intrusion. Only after this gentle reconnaissance would he open his eyes, and when he did, it was with what he described as the eyes of first seeing, as if encountering the world for the very first time. The play of light and shadow, the textures and colours that surrounded him, even the most familiar objects, seemed fresh and worthy of wonder when received through this quality of awakened attention. This reverent approach to the transition from sleep created what Musashi called the foundation of the day. Just as a house built on solid ground can weather any storm, a day that began from a place of inner stillness could handle whatever challenges arose without losing its essential stability. The peace he cultivated in those first moments became a reference point he could return to whenever circumstances became turbulent or demanding. But Musashi's understanding of conscious awakening went deeper than personal practice. He recognized that the way someone emerges from sleep reveals their fundamental relationship with existence itself. Those who approached awakening with violence or urgency were likely to meet all of life's transitions with the same quality of resistance and force. Those who could honor the natural rhythm of consciousness emerging from rest demonstrated a wisdom that would serve them in every aspect of living. This led him to develop what he termed the philosophy of transitions. Every moment of life, he realized, involves some form of awakening. Each breath was a small awakening from the pause that preceded it. Each step was an awakening into a new position and perspective. Each encounter with another person was an awakening into relationship. Each challenge was an awakening into previously unknown aspects of his own capacity. By learning to navigate the major transition from sleep to wakefulness with grace and awareness, Musashi trained himself to approach all of life's transitions with the same quality of presence. Whether facing a sword-wielding opponent or simply walking from one room to another, he could bring the same respectful attention to the process of change itself, finding stability not in avoiding transitions but in learning to dance with them skillfully. The samurai discovered that this approach to awakening had profound effects on his capacity for what he called instantaneous presence. In combat situations where a moment's distraction could mean death, the ability to become completely present immediately was essential. But this skill couldn't be developed through willpower alone. It emerged naturally from learning to inhabit each moment fully, starting with the very first moment of each day. His morning awakening practice became a form of training for life's unexpected demands. Just as he could emerge from sleep with complete alertness when circumstances required it, he could shift from peaceful contemplation to decisive action without losing his center. The same awareness that could appreciate the beauty of sunrise could perceive the subtle movements that indicated an opponent's intentions. The same presence that could rest comfortably in solitude could engage fully with the complex demands of social interaction. This integration of rest and alertness, of receptivity and responsiveness, became one of the hallmarks of Musashi's mature practice. He no longer saw sleep and wakefulness as opposite states but as different expressions of the same fundamental awareness. The consciousness that could rest peacefully during the night was the same consciousness that could respond instantly to any situation during the day. Learning to work with this awareness in all its modes became the foundation of what he called the unified life. As morning light strengthened and the world around him came fully alive, Musashi would continue what he termed the ceremony of arrival. This wasn't about rushing into activity, but about gradually expanding his circle of awareness to include the larger environment of which he was part. He would sense the quality of the air, the temperature and humidity that would influence his body throughout the day. He would notice the wind patterns that might affect travel or outdoor activities. He would observe the behavior of animals and birds, reading the subtle signs that revealed information about weather changes or potential disturbances in the area. This environmental awareness wasn't mere survival skill, but a way of understanding his place in the larger web of existence. By learning to read the natural world's subtle communications, Musashi developed a sensitivity that served him in all contexts. The same attention that could detect approaching storms could sense the unspoken tensions in social situations. The same awareness that could interpret animal behavior could read the intentions behind human words and gestures. This expanded awareness naturally led to what he called the practice of grateful recognition. As he became fully present to his surroundings, Musashi would acknowledge the countless gifts that supported his existence. The earth that provided solid ground beneath his feet, the air that filled his lungs with life-giving breath, the sun that offered warmth and light, the plants and animals that shared the landscape around him. This wasn't sentimental appreciation, but practical recognition of his fundamental interdependence with all of life. The practice of grateful recognition served multiple purposes in Musashi's approach to conscious living. It countered the illusion of separation that could make someone feel isolated or defensive. It cultivated humility by revealing how much his existence depended on forces beyond his control, and it generated what he described as natural generosity, a spontaneous desire to contribute to the web of relationships that sustained him. This morning recognition also prepared him for what he called the day's particular calling. Each day, Musashi understood, presented its own unique invitation for growth, service, or discovery. By becoming fully present to the actual conditions surrounding him, rather than imposing predetermined plans or expectations, he could sense what the day was asking of him. Sometimes the calling was for intense focus on training or study. Other times, it invited exploration of new territories or engagement with unfamiliar people. Sometimes, the greatest service was simply to rest and restore his energy for future demands. Learning to discern and respond to the day's particular calling required the kind of sensitivity that could only be cultivated through regular practice of solitude and conscious awakening. It demanded the ability to distinguish between authentic intuitive guidance and the random preferences of his personality. It required enough self-knowledge to recognize his genuine capacities and limitations, enough wisdom to know when to act and when to wait, enough courage to follow guidance that might conflict with conventional expectations. This responsiveness to life's deeper currents became one of Musashi's most distinctive characteristics. Unlike warriors who followed rigid training schedules or predetermined strategies, he remained fluid and adaptive, allowing his activities to emerge from present moment awareness rather than past conditioning. This didn't make him unpredictable or unreliable, but it gave his actions a quality of freshness and appropriateness that couldn't be achieved through mechanical repetition of learned behaviors. The samurai's approach to morning awakening also included what he termed the inventory of resources. This wasn't about cataloguing his possessions or calculating his advantages, but about honestly assessing his current physical, emotional, and mental condition. How much energy was available to him today? What was the quality of his motivation? Were there any areas of tension or concern that needed attention before he engaged with external demands? This internal inventory wasn't self-indulgent introspection, but practical preparation for effective action. Just as a craftsman checks his tools before beginning work, Musashi would assess the instrument of his own consciousness before engaging with the day's challenges. If he noticed fatigue, he might adjust his plans to include more rest. If he sensed emotional turbulence, he might spend extra time in contemplative practice. If his mind felt scattered, he might choose activities that supported focus and concentration. This honest self-assessment prevented the kind of overextension that led to burnout or poor decision-making. By working with his actual capacities rather than his idealized expectations, Musashi could sustain high levels of performance over long periods without depleting himself. He learned to recognize the difference between the temporary fatigue that came from appropriate effort and the deeper exhaustion that indicated he was working against his natural rhythms. The practice of resource inventory also helped him develop what he called the wisdom of limitations. Rather than seeing his constraints as problems to be overcome, Musashi learned to work with them as creative challenges that could lead to unexpected discoveries. When physical energy was limited, he might focus on mental training. When social interaction felt draining, he might retreat into solitary practice. When familiar approaches weren't working, he might experiment with entirely different methods. This acceptance of limitations didn't represent resignation or lowered standards. Instead, it reflected a mature understanding that working skillfully with constraints often produced more innovative and effective results than trying to force solutions through willpower alone. Like a river that finds its way around obstacles by following the path of least resistance, Musashi learned to accomplish his goals by working with available resources rather than fighting against unavoidable limitations. As the morning progressed and he prepared to engage more actively with the world, Musashi would conclude his awakening practice with what he called the offering of intention. So, this wasn't about setting rigid goals or trying to control outcomes, but about clarifying his deepest motivation for whatever activities lay ahead. Whether he planned to practice sword techniques, study philosophical texts, travel to a new location, or simply tend to basic needs, he would offer his efforts to something larger than personal achievement or satisfaction. This offering of intention connected his individual actions to universal principles that transcended his personal concerns. He might dedicate his practice to understanding the nature of courage, his study to discovering deeper truths about existence, his travels to serving others he might encounter along the way. By aligning his activities with these larger purposes, Musashi found that his efforts carried more meaning and generated more energy than when he acted purely from personal motivation. The practice of offering intention also protected him from what he observed as the spiritual danger of achievement. Success in any endeavor could become a source of pride or attachment that actually undermined further progress. By dedicating his efforts to purposes beyond personal gain, Musashi could enjoy success without being trapped by it, could learn from failure without being defeated by it, could engage fully with his activities while remaining inwardly free from their outcomes. This freedom from attachment to results didn't make him careless or half-hearted in his efforts. If anything, it allowed him to engage more completely because he wasn't dividing his attention between the task at hand and concerns about its consequences. Like an artist who becomes so absorbed in the creative process that self-consciousness disappears, Musashi could give himself fully to whatever he was doing while remaining unattached to how others might judge his performance. The integration of conscious awakening with purposeful intention created what Musashi described as the seamless day. Instead of experiencing his life as a series of disconnected activities held together only by the passage of time, he began to sense an underlying continuity that gave meaning and coherence to even the most mundane tasks. The same awareness that awakened peacefully in the morning could be present during combat training, travel, meals, and conversations with others. This seamless quality didn't eliminate the natural rhythms of activity and rest, engagement, and solitude, but it provided a thread of consciousness that remained constant through all variations. Like a river that maintains its identity while flowing through different landscapes, Musashi's awareness could adapt to any situation while preserving its essential character. The practical benefits of this integrated approach extended far beyond personal satisfaction or spiritual development. Musashi found that his effectiveness in all areas increased dramatically when he stopped fragmenting his attention between competing demands and learned to bring his whole self to whatever he was doing. His sword technique improved because he could be completely present during practice rather than thinking about other concerns. His strategic thinking became clearer because he could access the stillness that allowed deeper insights to emerge. His relationships with others deepened because he could listen with his full attention rather than formulating responses while they spoke. Perhaps most importantly, this approach to conscious living eliminated what Musashi identified as the primary source of human suffering. The constant sense of being somewhere else, of missing life while thinking about it, of being so focused on the future or the past that the present moment remained unexperienced. By learning to awaken fully to each moment as it arose, he discovered a richness and vitality in ordinary experience that had been hidden by his previous patterns of distraction and preoccupation. This awakened presence also revealed the extraordinary nature of what most people considered mundane activities. Preparing and eating food became opportunities for meditation on the interconnectedness of all life. Walking became a form of moving prayer that connected him intimately with the earth beneath his feet. Even basic maintenance tasks like cleaning his weapons or mending his clothes carried the same sacred quality that he brought to formal spiritual practices. The samurai's understanding of conscious awakening culminated in what he called the recognition of the eternal morning. Through years of practice, he began to experience each moment as a fresh beginning, regardless of what had happened in the past or what might occur in the future. This wasn't denial of continuity or consequence, but recognition that the present moment always contains infinite potential for renewal and transformation. This recognition freed him from the burden of carrying past mistakes or successes as permanent aspects of his identity. Each morning's awakening became a reminder that he could approach the day with fresh eyes and an open heart, regardless of what had occurred previously. Each moment offered an opportunity to respond to life from his deepest wisdom rather than his accumulated conditioning. The eternal morning also revealed the futility of postponing fulfillment until some future achievement or circumstance. If awakening was always available in the present moment, then the peace and strength he sought were not distant goals to be reached, but immediate possibilities to be recognized. This didn't eliminate the value of long-term goals or careful planning, but it provided a foundation of contentment that wasn't dependent on external outcomes. Through his mastery of conscious awakening, Musashi discovered that the strength he had been seeking through external achievement had been present within him all along, not as something he needed to develop, but as the awe-require very ground of his being. This recognition didn't diminish his appreciation for skill, accomplishment, or engagement with the world, but it provided an unshakable foundation from which all activities could arise naturally and effortlessly. The path he pioneered offers profound guidance for anyone seeking to transform their relationship with rest, awakening, and conscious living. In our contemporary world of alarm clocks and urgent schedules, his insights about the importance of gentle transitions feel almost revolutionary. We live in an era where most people assault themselves awake each morning, then wonder why they feel fragmented and reactive throughout the day. Musashi's approach suggests a radically different possibility. What if we could learn to surface from sleep like divers rising slowly through layers of consciousness? What if our first moments of awareness could become opportunities for grateful recognition rather than anxious planning? What if the transition from rest to activity could preserve rather than shatter the wholeness we touch during the night? The samurai's path shows us that true strength doesn't require constant activity or external validation. It emerges from learning to be fully present with whatever is arising in each moment, starting with the very first moment of each day. When we learn to awaken consciously, we discover that every transition in life becomes an opportunity to practice the art of presence. Every challenge becomes a chance to access the inner stillness that is always available. Every moment becomes a doorway into the inexhaustible source of wisdom and strength that has been waiting patiently within us all along. In this recognition, the ancient samurai's insights about solitude and inner strength reveal their contemporary relevance. We don't need to retreat to mountain caves or engage in formal combat to benefit from his discoveries. We need only the willingness to bring conscious attention to the simple act of awakening each day, to honor the natural rhythms of rest and activity, and to discover for ourselves the profound peace that becomes available when we learn to find our strength not in external circumstances, but in the depths of our own awakened awareness. The warrior's deepest teaching about the relationship between solitude and service emerged during what he called the years of invisible wandering. After mastering his own inner landscape through decades of contemplative practice, Musashi entered a period where his external activities appeared unremarkable to casual observers. Yet his influence on the world around him became more profound than ever before. He would arrive in villages as an ordinary traveller, seeking simple lodging and basic meals. To most inhabitants, he appeared to be nothing more than another wandering ronin, perhaps a bit more courteous than most, but certainly not someone of particular significance. Yet invariably, during his brief stays, subtle changes would begin to ripple through the community in ways that couldn't be traced to any specific actions or words. Disputes that had simmered for months would suddenly find resolution. Young people struggling with direction would discover clarity about their paths. Merchants who had been locked in bitter competition would begin to cooperate. Families torn by old grievances would start the delicate process of reconciliation. These transformations didn't happen through Musashi's direct intervention or advice giving, but seemed to emerge naturally from his simple presence among them. The samurai had discovered what he termed the transmission of stillness. Just as a tuning fork can cause other instruments to resonate at the same frequency, someone who has learned to embody inner peace naturally invites that same quality to emerge in others. This wasn't a technique that could be learned or applied deliberately, but a natural consequence of having genuinely integrated the lessons of solitude into one's being. This invisible influence operated through what Musashi called the language of presence. Every interaction, no matter how brief or seemingly casual, became an opportunity to demonstrate the possibility of responding to life's challenges from a place of inner equilibrium rather than reactive emotion. When someone spoke to him with anger, he could listen without defensiveness. When others expressed fear or confusion, he could offer his attention without trying to fix or change their experience. When people shared their joys and successes, he could celebrate with them without comparison or envy. These responses weren't performed or calculated for effect. They arose spontaneously from the deep reservoir of peace he had cultivated through years of solitary practice. Like water that naturally flows downhill, his interactions naturally moved toward greater harmony and understanding because that had become his internal default state. Musashi began to understand that this was perhaps the most important fruit of his long engagement with solitude. The strength he had discovered in aloneness wasn't meant to be hoarded or kept separate from the world, but to be offered as a gift to the human community of which he was part. The peace he had found in stillness could become a source of healing for the collective anxiety and conflict that seemed to characterize so much of human interaction. This realization led him to develop what he called the practice of anonymous service. Daisho. Instead of seeking recognition for his contributions or building a reputation as a teacher or master, Musashi learned to offer his gifts in ways that appeared to arise naturally from circumstances themselves. A word of encouragement offered at precisely the right moment. A small act of practical assistance that prevented larger problems from developing. A quality of listening that allowed someone to discover their own wisdom rather than depending on external advice. The effectiveness of this anonymous service often surprised even Musashi himself, because he wasn't trying to control outcomes or claim credit for improvements. His interventions could address root causes rather than surface symptoms. People didn't develop dependency on his guidance because they experienced insights as arising from their own understanding. Communities didn't fragment into factions supporting or opposing his influence because his contributions remained largely invisible to ordinary observation. This approach required what he termed the discipline of egoless action. Every impulse to be recognized, appreciated, or remembered had to be noticed and gently released. Every desire to see immediate results from his efforts had to be surrendered to larger patterns of change that might unfold over months or years. Every tendency to take credit for positive developments had to be transformed into gratitude for the privilege of participating in the natural healing processes that seemed to occur whenever authentic peace encountered human suffering. The discipline of egoless action proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of Musashi's mature practice. It was far easier to face armed opponents in formal combat than to serve others while remaining completely indifferent to recognition or reward. The ego that had been refined through years of spiritual practice could still find subtle ways to seek validation, to compare his contributions with those of others, to take satisfaction in being needed or valued. But Musashi discovered that these remaining traces of self-importance were actually the final obstacles to complete effectiveness in service. As long as any part of him was seeking personal satisfaction from his contributions, that much of his energy was diverted from the actual work at hand. Only when he could act from pure responsiveness to what each situation required, without any agenda for how his actions should be received or remembered, could his full capacity become available for the benefit of others. This led to what he described as the paradox of invisible mastery. The more skillfully he learned to serve others, the less anyone could identify him as the source of positive changes in their lives. The more profound his influence became, the more it appeared to arise from natural processes rather than individual intervention. The more effective his teaching became, the less anyone thought of him as a teacher at all. Rather than frustrating him, this invisibility became a source of deep satisfaction. It confirmed that his years of solitary practice had truly transformed the quality of his presence, rather than simply adding new techniques to his repertoire. It demonstrated that he had learned to work with life's deeper currents rather than trying to impose his personal will upon circumstances. Most importantly, it showed that his service was actually serving, creating genuine benefit rather than simply satisfying his own need to feel useful or important. The samurai's understanding of invisible service extended to his approach to what he called the teaching that doesn't teach. When people did approach him directly for guidance about martial arts, philosophy, or life direction, Musashi developed ways of responding that helped them discover their own answers rather than providing ready-made solutions. He learned to ask questions that revealed assumptions, to point out contradictions that invited deeper inquiry, to create situations where insights could emerge naturally from direct experience. This approach honored what he had learned about the fundamental solitude of each human consciousness. No one could walk another person's path or learn another person's lessons. The most helpful thing he could do was to create conditions where others could encounter their own inner wisdom more clearly, could recognize their own capacity for strength and clarity, could develop confidence in their ability to navigate life's challenges from their own center of understanding. The teaching that doesn't teach required tremendous restraint and patience. It was often tempting to share insights that had taken him years to develop, to save others from mistakes he had made, to offer solutions that seemed obvious from his perspective. But Musashi recognized that wisdom imposed from outside, no matter how accurate or well-intentioned, couldn't take root in the same way as understanding that grew from within. Instead of providing answers, he learned to be a mirror that reflected people's questions back to them with greater clarity. Instead of offering techniques, he demonstrated ways of being that others could explore and adapt to their own circumstances. Instead of teaching concepts, He embodied principles that could be absorbed through prolonged association rather than intellectual explanation. This approach to teaching perfectly complemented his mastery of conscious solitude. Just as he had learned to find strength within himself rather than depending on external supports, he encouraged others to discover their own inner resources rather than becoming dependent on his guidance. The same respect for individual autonomy that had guided his solitary practice naturally extended to his interactions with others. The effectiveness of this non-directive approach became evident in the quality of students it attracted and developed. Rather than drawing people who sought easy answers or quick fixes, Musashi found himself surrounded by individuals who were genuinely committed to their own growth and understanding. Instead of creating followers who imitated his methods, he inspired explorers who developed their own unique approaches to the challenges he had faced. These relationships, based on mutual respect rather than dependency, Musashi's continued development. He found that creative solutions to familiar problems, as they learn, became another source of nourishment for learned as much from observing others from his example. Each person's unique way of integrating solitude with service, contemplation with action, inner development with outer contribution, added new dimensions to his understanding of human possibility. This mutual enrichment revealed another aspect of what Musashi called the great solitude. The deepest aloneness wasn't separation from others, but recognition of the unique path that each consciousness must walk. When this individuality was truly honored, rather than threatening connection, it actually made more authentic relationship possible. People could meet each other as they actually were, rather than as projections of what they hoped to find or feared to encounter. The samurai's mature years demonstrated the practical fruits of integrating solitary practice with selfless service. Instead of the withdrawal from the world that some expected from a master of contemplative disciplines, he entered into increasingly rich engagement with the full spectrum of human experience. His capacity for both solitude and relationship, for both inner development and outer contribution, continued to expand throughout his life. His approach to what he called the seamless service reflected this integration. Whether sitting in silent meditation or engaged in animated conversation, whether practicing sword techniques or preparing simple meals, whether traveling alone through mountain passes or participating in community celebrations, he maintained the same quality of presence that he had discovered in his years of intensive solitary practice. This seamless quality didn't eliminate the natural rhythms of engagement and withdrawal, activity and rest, speaking and silence. Rather, it provided a thread of consciousness that remained constant through all variations. Like a river that maintains its essential character while flowing through different landscapes, Musashi's awareness could adapt to any situation while preserving the inner stillness that had become his foundation. The practical applications of his discoveries about integrating solitude with service speak directly to contemporary challenges about work-life balance, social responsibility, and individual fulfillment. In our modern world, these are often treated as competing priorities that require difficult choices and constant compromise. Musashi's example suggests a different possibility entirely. What if the same practices that restore us individually could also serve the collective good? What if the inner development that occurs in solitude naturally expressed itself as more skillful engagement with others? What if learning to find strength within ourselves actually increased our capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world around us? The samurai's path shows us that these apparent contradictions dissolve when we stop viewing solitude and service as separate activities and begin to understand them as different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to awakened living. The person who has learned to find completeness within themselves can offer their gifts freely because they're not seeking to fill an inner void through external achievements. The individual who has discovered peace in aloneness can remain centered during interpersonal conflicts because they depend on others' approval sense of well-being, dozen or agreement. This integration of inner development with outer contribution offers a model for what Musashi called the sustainable path. Instead of alternating between periods of self-focused development and selfless service, burning out from overextension, or becoming isolated through excessive introspection, we can learn to find practices that simultaneously nourish our individual growth and contribute to collective healing. The key insight that emerged from Musashi's years of practice was that authentic service doesn't require self-sacrifice, but rather self-knowledge. The more clearly someone understands their own patterns, motivations, and capacities, the more effectively they can contribute to situations that call for their particular gifts. The more deeply someone has explored their own consciousness, the more skillfully they can recognize what others need without projecting their own issues onto external circumstances. This self-knowledge, cultivated through regular engagement with solitude, becomes the foundation for what Musashi termed precision in service. Instead of helping in ways that feel good to the helper but may not address actual needs, instead of offering solutions that worked for oneself but may not fit others' circumstances, instead of imposing one's values or perspectives on situations that require different approaches, the person grounded in self-awareness can respond to each situation from clarity rather than assumption. The precision that emerges from this grounded responsiveness often appears almost magical to those who witness it. Someone might offer exactly the right word at precisely the moment when it can be most helpful. A small gesture might prevent a major conflict from developing. A willingness to remain silent might create space for others to discover solutions they wouldn't have found if given premature advice. But these apparently miraculous interventions aren't supernatural gifts. They're natural consequences of learning to respond from presence rather than reactivity, from clarity rather than confusion, from love rather than fear. The same awareness that can rest peacefully in solitude can perceive subtle needs and opportunities that remain invisible to more agitated consciousness. Musashi's final teaching about the relationship between solitude and service might be his most profound contribution to understanding human potential. Through decades of practice, he discovered that the apparent boundary between self and others, between individual development and collective benefit, between personal peace and social harmony, dissolves when consciousness is no longer fragmented by the illusion of separation. In his deepest experiences of solitary meditation, the sense of being an isolated individual gave way to recognition of the fundamental interconnectedness that links all existence. This wasn't a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that transformed how he understood both rest and action. Sleep became participation in the same stillness that underlies all movement. Service became expression of the same love that had nourished his solitary contemplation. This recognition didn't eliminate his appreciation for individual uniqueness or the importance of personal boundaries. Rather, it provided a foundation of unity that made healthy differentiation possible. Like instruments in an orchestra that can play their distinct parts precisely because they're all tuned to the same fundamental pitch, people who have touched this deeper connection can serve their individual purposes more effectively because they are aligned with larger harmonies. The practical implications of this understanding extend far beyond personal spiritual development into questions of leadership, community building, and social transformation. Musashi's example suggests that the most effective way to contribute to collective healing isn't through activism that burns out from overextension or withdrawal that abandons responsibility, but through the integration of inner development with outer service that he pioneered. This integrated approach offers hope for addressing contemporary challenges that seem to require both individual transformation and collective action. Climate change, social inequality, political polarization, and other complex problems may be most effectively addressed by people who have learned to combine the wisdom that emerges from solitude with the compassion that expresses itself in service. The samurai's path shows us that this combination isn't just possible, but necessary for anyone seeking to live with both authenticity and effectiveness. The strength we discover in solitude naturally seeks expression in contribution to the world's healing. The peace we find in stillness naturally radiates outward as a gift to others who are still struggling within a conflict. The love we encounter in the depths of our own being naturally extends itself toward all life. In learning to sleep with inner strength, as Musashi understood it, we don't withdraw from the world, but prepare ourselves to engage with it more skillfully. The rest we find in conscious solitude becomes a resource we can offer to others. The wisdom we discover in silence becomes guidance we can share through both words and presence. The strength we cultivate through inner work becomes capacity we can dedicate to service. This is perhaps the ultimate teaching that emerges from the legendary swordsman's exploration of solitude and inner strength. True power doesn't isolate us from others, but connects us more deeply to the web of relationships that sustains all life. Authentic rest doesn't separate us from activity, but makes all our actions more effective. Genuine solitude doesn't create loneliness, but reveals the love that has been present all along, waiting patiently for us to recognize it, cultivate it, and offer it as our gift to a world that desperately needs the healing that only awakened hearts can provide. Through Musashi's example, we see that the path to inner strength through solitude ultimately leads not away from the world, but deeper into loving engagement with it. The warrior who has learned to find peace in aloneness discovers that true strength expresses itself most fully in service to the whole of which we are all part. In this recognition, the ancient wisdom of the samurai reveals its contemporary relevance, offering guidance for anyone seeking to live with both depth and purpose in our complex and challenging times. The way forward that Musashi pioneered remains open to anyone willing to explore the depths of their own consciousness with courage, patience, and dedication. It requires no special talents or circumstances, only the willingness to spend time alone with ourselves, to listen deeply to what silence and to discover arises in the what remains when all external supports are temporarily set aside. In these quiet moments, we may encounter the same source of undefeated strength that sustained the legendary swordsman through decades of challenges and changes. This discovery doesn't mark the end of our journey, but its true beginning. For only when we have learned to find completeness within ourselves can we offer our authentic gifts to others. Only when we have touched the peace that surpasses understanding can we become agents of healing in a world torn by conflict. Only when we have learned to rest deeply can we act with the sustained effectiveness that genuine service requires. The invitation that Musashi extends across the centuries is simple yet profound. Begin where you are, with whatever capacity you currently possess. Create space in your daily routine for conscious solitude, even if only for a few minutes at first. Learn to approach rest as an opportunity for renewal rather than mere escape. Discover what remains constant within yourself, despite all the changes that occur around you. As this practice deepens, you may find that the strength you seek has been present within you all along, not as something you need to develop, but as the very ground of your being. And in that recognition, the path of the warrior reveals its ultimate secret. True victory doesn't require defeating external opponents, but learning to live in harmony with the mystery of existence itself. Through this recognition, the samurai's teachings become more than historical curiosity. They transform into practical wisdom for anyone struggling with the modern epidemic of restlessness. In our age of endless notifications and artificial urgency, Musashi's approach to what he called the discipline of sacred pausing offers a radical alternative to the cultural assumption that constant activity equals meaningful progress. He understood that most people mistake motion for movement, confusing the frantic spinning of mental wheels with genuine advancement toward their deeper purposes. During his later years, Musashi observed that those who seemed most busy often accomplished the least of lasting value, while those who had learned to work from stillness could achieve remarkable results with what appeared to be minimal effort. This led him to develop what he termed the practice of intelligent inactivity. This wasn't laziness or procrastination, but the sophisticated ability to recognize when not acting was the most powerful choice available. Like a master archer who knows that the moment before releasing the arrow is as crucial as the release itself, Musashi learned to inhabit the pregnant pause before action with complete presence and awareness. These moments of conscious hesitation became opportunities for what he called consulting the deeper intelligence. Beneath the surface chatter of the thinking mind, he had discovered a more subtle form of knowing that could assess complex situations with remarkable accuracy. This intelligence couldn't be accessed through analytical reasoning or forced through willpower, but emerged naturally in the spaciousness of alert stillness. The practical applications of this deeper consultation became evident in every aspect of his life. Before entering any engagement, whether martial or social, he would create a brief moment of internal silence where he could sense the currents flowing beneath surface appearances. Was this the right time for his intervention? Did the situation call for directness or subtlety? Would his presence contribute to harmony or create unnecessary complication? These micro-meditations, lasting perhaps only a few heartbeats, provided information that proved far more reliable than elaborate strategic planning or emotional reactions. They revealed not what he wanted to happen or feared might occur, but what was actually trying to emerge from the deeper patterns operating within each situation. Musashi discovered that this practice of consulting inner wisdom became more refined the more regularly he engaged with extended periods of solitude. The quiet hours spent alone weren't separate from his active engagement with the world, but preparation for it. Like a musician who practices scales in private so that public performance can flow effortlessly, his solitary contemplation created the internal conditions that allowed spontaneous wisdom to arise during interpersonal encounters. This understanding led to what he described as the rhythm of expansion and contraction. Instead of trying to maintain constant availability or perpetual productivity, Musashi learned to alternate between periods of intensive engagement and intervals of complete withdrawal. The energy that flowed outward during times of service was balanced by the restoration that occurred during conscious solitude. But this wasn't merely a practical strategy for preventing burnout. Musashi recognized that consciousness itself operated according to these natural rhythms, and that fighting against them created the internal friction that most people experienced as stress or dissatisfaction. By aligning his activities with these deeper cycles, he could sustain high levels of effectiveness over decades without depleting his essential vitality. The samurai's approach to what he called the art of conscious completion emerged from this understanding of natural rhythms. Most people, he observed, carried unfinished business from one activity into the next, creating a kind of psychic residue that accumulated over time and eventually interfered with clear perception and appropriate response. Each evening, as part of his transition toward rest, Musashi would perform what he termed the ceremony of conscious conclusion. This involved mentally reviewing the day's activities, not with judgment or analysis, but with the intention of bringing each experience to a state of internal completion. Conversations that had ended awkwardly could be resolved energetically through forgiveness or understanding. Tasks that remained physically incomplete could be finished psychologically by accepting their current state and releasing attachment to specific outcomes. This practice of conscious completion served multiple purposes. It prevented the accumulation of psychic debris that could disturb sleep or cloud judgment. It created clear boundaries between different aspects of his life, allowing him to be fully present with whatever he was engaged in rather than mentally rehearsing other concerns. Most importantly, it cultivated what he called the capacity for fresh beginning, the ability to approach each new moment without being burdened by the residue of past experiences. The ceremony of conscious completion also extended to his relationship with his own thoughts and emotions. Musashi learned to treat his internal experiences with the same respect he brought to external encounters. Feelings of anger, sadness, or fear were acknowledged as temporary visitors rather than permanent residents, welcomed for whatever wisdom they might offer, then thanked and released when their message had been received. This didn't involve suppressing or denying difficult emotions, but rather developing what he called the host consciousness, a quality of awareness spacious enough to accommodate any experience without being overwhelmed by it. Like a vast sky that can hold storms without being damaged by them, this expanded awareness could witness intense feelings without being diminished or defined by them. 8. The cultivation of host consciousness became one of Musashi's most practical contributions to the art of conscious living. In a world where most people either suppressed their emotions or were controlled by them, he demonstrated a third option: the ability to experience feelings fully while maintaining the inner stability that allowed appropriate response rather than reactive behavior. This emotional mastery proved essential during what he described as the trials of late mastery. As his reputation grew and students began seeking his guidance, Musashi faced challenges that tested his understanding in ways that formal dueling never had. The responsibility of influencing others' development, the temptation to enjoy the admiration he received, the subtle pressure to maintain an image of perfection, all these presented obstacles that couldn't be overcome through superior technique or strategic thinking. And so, as the gentle light of dawn touches the edges of our exploration, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a threshold. Musashi's path through the landscapes of solitude reveals something profound, yet elegantly simple. The strength we seek has been resting quietly within us all along, patient as mountain stone, fluid as flowing water, waiting for us to cease our restless searching and simply come home to ourselves. Tonight, as you prepare for your own journey into rest, perhaps you'll carry with you the samurai's gentle wisdom. That sleep need not be escape but arrival. That solitude need not be loneliness, but the deepest form of companionship. That in learning to befriend the silence within ourselves, we discover the unshakable foundation from which all genuine strength emerges. Thank you for walking this contemplative path with me through the wisdom of ages. If these philosophical wanderings have brought you even a moment of peace, a like and subscribe helps this small channel continue growing, like seeds of ancient wisdom, finding new soil in modern hearts. Until we meet again in another gentle exploration, may your rest be deep, your solitude nourishing, and your inner strength as constant as the stars. Sweet dreams, fellow philosophers.